Journal of Aegund of Clan Althend. 3 of Winter, Year 1011, after Apotheosis. They came from the sea. Their ship was nothing like I'd ever seen. It spewed sparks and smoke but bore neither oar nor mast. A strange magic must have compelled it. As it drew closer to port, my mother, who is a forest elf, complained of a terrible noise emanating from its bowels. Equally strange were the folk that crewed it. Men, they called themselves. They were thick-set creatures with flat faces and dour frowns. My mother said they looked like elves who'd been run over by a cart. After mooring themselves, one of the men, who I presume was the captain due to him being the only man not covered in black soot, came ashore. He was quick to seek out the portmaster. The two spoke in earnest before the captain gathered his sailors, no more than a dozen men, and set off into the city, heading towards the palace. Peculiar creatures. 59 of Winter, Year 1011, after Apotheosis. I almost didn't make the connection when I received a letter from my cousin, a lighthouse keeper in the east. She wrote of a grand fleet gathered along the shore. Many sorts of ships made up their number, but together they spewed enough black smoke to blot out the suns. Make no mistake, she told me, we are to be invaded, and I knew by whom. That very night I bought an officer's commission at the garrison. My mother begged me not to, but I knew I must. War is coming, and I refuse to stand idle. 61 of Winter, Year 1011, after Apotheosis. I have not been able to write for some time. Our army has been moving at a breakneck pace towards the east. As we go, we levy every able-bodied elf we come across. Despite only being a junior officer, I now have nearly 100 soldiers under my command. Most are conscripted peasants, but I also control a small corps of sorcerers and even a destiny teller. Our goal is to reach the eastern shore before the men can make landfall. I fear we are already too late. I spoke to my destiny teller about the future of the eastern provinces, but she was tight-lipped, even under direct order. It has been 3 days since I last received a letter from my cousin. 64 of Winter, Year 1011, after Apotheosis. This morning, our scouts spotted refugees. We were too slow. They spoke of war. The capital of the East, the stalwart city of Falhaid, had been sacked. In a matter of hours, its walls had been toppled, and men poured into their streets. All those who could, fled. Those who did not, died. It was an unnerving story. When I was young, my mother told me tales of the courage and strength of the warriors of Falhaid during times of old, before even Apotheosis. Dragons and ogres could not best them, but men could. 66 of Winter, Year 1011, after Apotheosis. This morning I found our destiny teller dead. She'd cut her own throat with a dagger. I hid the body and told my soldiers she'd deserted. They didn't need know, especially before our first encounter with man. We were to meet the men at the edge of the arbor, that ancient and vast forest that separates the capital from the east. Trees older than most clans towered above our line. By noon, our scouts had spotted the armies of man. They marched across the plains of the east in a direction that would take them straight to the capital. Behind them, a dozen cities burned and ran red with blood. We were all that stood between them and the central provinces. When I first saw them cresting the horizon, I was surprised. They wore uniforms. Every man wore the same khaki garb with a tin helmet atop their head. Never had I seen such conformity in an army. Then, there were their weapons. They were called rifles. I'd been told of them by the refugees we'd met. Their premise was based in the long-forgotten art of alchemy, projectiles powered by unstable alchemical reactions. It was a crude concept, sharpened to a razor edge. The worst part was that any fool could wield one with deadly efficiency. No matter, Field Marshal Yiltrid told us. Like all the foes before them, man's armies would be broken under our might. She ordered our sappers to construct palisades at the mouth of the arbor, and for the bulk of our force to form up behind them. In theory, the men's rifle fire would be stopped by the palisades, and they'd be forced to fight us with their bayonets, where we would best them in the resulting melee. Before the war horn was sounded, I spoke to the field marshal and told her that if the men had bested the walls of Falheed, then her palisades would fare no better. Although she assured me her plan was sound on account of our numerical advantage, I requested to be placed in reserve. It is a decision I credit with saving my life and the lives of those under me. I am no coward, but I concede I felt a great fear as the men sounded the bugle call that marked the commencement of their attack. I recall hearing a distant thunder from far behind their battle lines. At the sound, every forest elf in sight clutched at their ears in apparent pain. A moment later, the skies above us shattered. Artillery. Field Marshal Yiltrid did not count on the accuracy of the barrage nor its intensity. She paid with her life. I estimate that 1 in every 10 of our soldiers was killed in the initial bombardment alone. When what was left of us rallied, we found the battleground was no longer the arbor, but a crater-pocked wasteland. In such a desolate environment, the men excelled. We were reduced even further under relentless volley fire from their riflemen, who, with our palisades pulverized, refused to commit to a melee. I was not surprised when I heard the vice marshal call the order to retreat. In fact, I was relieved. 20 of spring, year 1011, after apotheosis. Much has changed since our first encounter with the men. We learned that to face them on the field under the gaze of their guns would be madness, so we took to the trees. As the enemy army marches through the arbor, we make them pay for every step taken. We ambush their scouts, attack their camps at night, and lay booby traps for their patrols. In the dense forest, their rifles become unwieldy, and their artillery is obscured by the canopy. The forest elves among us are particularly adept at this form of combat. Among the glades of the arbor, their elegance matches that of a dancer. I've seen dozens of men fall to their well-placed arrows. These tactics are effective, but taxing. The men have struggled to gain a foothold, but are beginning to learn. Rather than traverse the tangles of the arbor, they use a weapon that spews fire like a dragon to burn through it. What's more, the men can communicate across great distances. On several occasions, men have spoken into a gadget, and their comrades from afar have come to their aid. Forest elves, with their hearing being what it is, can often hear when these communications are made. Perhaps in combination with a translation spell, this could prove exploitable. Still, even with all their tricks, at this rate, they will not prevail. The vice marshal tells me that man's armies are spread thin. Reports from other marshals across the continent indicate that the men are advancing rapidly in every direction at once with no reserves. Our armies grow every day, while theirs are whittled away by attrition. This is not the sort of war I thought I'd be fighting, but I swear that I'll see it through. 39 of spring, year 1011, after apotheosis. A high elf from the capital arrived at our camp today. He looked so very out of place walking among battle-weary soldiers in his billowing white gown. He'd come to speak to me. He said he'd read my reports on man's methods of communication and told me that this information had been used by elves on other fronts to great effect. Because of this, he'd come to offer me a junior position in the spy ring. I was not about to cross a high elf, so I accepted. I leave for the capital tomorrow. My soldiers wished me a somber goodbye, and we shared a drink. I think they resent me. After all, they can't leave. 42 of spring, year 1011, after apotheosis. I write from my chambers in the palace court. Never have I felt linens this fine. My parents were overjoyed to see me arrive home safely, but I had little time for reunions, for there is work to be done. The high elf I met in the arbor has become my mentor. His name is Dohart, and can claim his lineage too before the apotheosis. He is a good teacher, but strict. I've learnt a great deal under him. Here in the court, I've received news from the other fronts. On land, our forces are winning. Despite man's technological advantages, their tactics are foolish at best and suicidal at worst. Man's supply lines are becoming increasingly unwieldy, and the front line is now so large that our armies have broken through at several points. Despite this, their morale remains high, and they fight fiercely, often to the man. On the sea, however, man fares better. Since the beginning of the invasion, their navy has remained moored at the beachhead they landed at. Our own navy has made several attempts to dislodge them and to bring an early end to the war. But man's flagship, a steel-hulled dreadnought named the Spirit of Eridani, has sent many an elvish sailor to an early grave. Nonetheless, at this rate, all my training will be for naught. 50 of spring, year 1011, after apotheosis. Dohart is dead. Men killed him where he lay last night. Many others met the same fate. Under moonlight, a team of parachutists jumped from balloons straight into the palace court itself. The watch captain claims there were no more than 4 dozen. Based on the damage they dealt, I'd have guessed an army had landed. These men were of a different caliber than those I'd fought in the arbor. They were both better equipped and better trained. They bore both rifle and saber. Their rifles were of an uncommon sort, for they had machining so intricate that they loaded themselves. The result was that the men could shoot faster than a battle line in volley fire, and if an elf managed to close the distance with them, they'd meet bronze with steel. In the aftermath of the skirmish, I saw many a shattered blade, none steel. Their objective was unclear. Most of the men had died in the fighting, but some had fled to the docks and escaped in stolen boats. The watch captain claims they were attempting to decapitate our command, or perhaps even to assassinate the Godhead. But I have my doubts. I found the court cartographer's chambers had been ransacked with a great deal of maps missing. With Dohart and his peers dead, I have inherited provisional command of the spy ring. It is a great responsibility, but I intend to do it justice. 78 of spring, year 1011, after apotheosis. The Grand Marshal spoke to me today. He says that man's flank has finally collapsed. Last night, what was left of their forces in the arbor made a hasty retreat across the eastern provinces. The Marshal asserts they realized the risk of encirclement and withdrew to protect their supply lines. It is a sound analysis, but I sense something is wrong. Nevertheless, this is an opportunity. Among the confusion of a mass withdrawal, I will see a plan of mine carried out. A spy will be sent to the lands of man. Even if we drive man back to the sea, we must understand why they first came here, Only by knowing our enemy can we truly defeat them. 1 of summer, year 1011, after apotheosis. A scout on the front sent urgent word to the court last night. Her message found its way into my hands. She claims that she's seen enormous convoys of motor carriages driving away from the front. After tracking them as far as the eastern provinces, she suspects they are heading for Man's beachhead. Their cargo remains a mystery. Using this information as well as some borrowed maps, I determined the carriages were likely coming from the mountaintop city of Utherd, the last city to be seized by Man. Curiously, its capture coincides with the collapse in Man's flank and the palace raid. The three are clearly connected. Tonight, I will implore the Grand Marshal to recapture Utherd. My spy cannot arrive in the land of Man sooner. Last I'd heard was that she'd stowed away on a homeward-bound supply vessel. May the Godhead watch over her. 6 of summer, year 1011, after apotheosis. The Grand Marshal led an attack on Utherd. Already the wounded have started to arrive back in the court. I saw one soldier arrive in the capital upon a drawn carriage missing both legs. I stopped him and asked of Utherd. He told me the men fought with a ferocity he'd not seen before. Even worse, they'd brought a terrible new weapon to bear. It was a sort of artillery piece made of neither bronze nor steel that looked entirely dissimilar from other such weapons. He told me that it fired a shell so potent that it set the air behind it aflame. My suspicions have been confirmed. To commit such a weapon to Utherd suggests that the collapse of their flank was a planned withdrawal, with the goal of reducing the front line to what was necessary to hold Utherd. Utherd must be retaken at any cost. 18 of summer, year 1011, after apotheosis. My spy has arrived in the land of Man. She wrote that the port city she arrived in was larger than even the great river city of Martime. However, the skies have been blotted out by a soot so thick that there is no difference between day and night. Surely the men know that if we do not defeat them, their own hubris would. Nature must be kept in a careful balance, a balance that Man has tipped. My spy tells me the motor carriages from Utherd have made their way into a curiously well-defended part of the city. She will try to sneak in at the first opportunity. What will she find? 25 of summer, year 1011, after apotheosis. The Grand Marshal agreed with my conclusions and agreed to fully commit to taking Utherd. Conventional attack would not suffice, so we sought the assistance of the reclusive sorcerers of Mount Skemgar. After long negotiations, our diplomats convinced them to revoke their vows of pacifism to defeat Man. With their most ancient spells, all created before apotheosis, the sorcerers conjured a great ice storm over Utherd that raged for 3 days and 3 nights. The defenders froze where they stood. Still, when the storm had passed and all was quiet, our armies marching into Utherd came under fire from the strange cannon that had vaporized so many soldiers in our initial attack. Clearly it was built to an entirely different standard than the rest of Man's inventions. However, without protection, the weapon was destroyed by a sorcerer's well-placed spell. Utherd is ours. I will travel there personally to see what can be learnt. 33 of summer, year 1011, after apotheosis. Man was doing something in Utherd. While they occupied the city, Man had razed Utherd's renowned temple district to the ground and dug a massive quarry in its place. While soldiers were fighting and dying on the battlements, miners had been digging this. Much of the equipment in the quarry, some with men still frozen to them, boast a degree of complexity similar to their strange canon. There is much to be learnt here. But what? The Grand Marshal tells me that while I was traveling, the armies of man had begun a full retreat to the ocean. He asserts that retaking Utherd was the nail in their coffin, and that the war is won, all thanks to me. He and his officers will be hosting a feast, with me as the guest of honor, in celebration. Their optimism is commendable, but foolish. If we do not know why man first came here, how can we know if they lost? This is far from over. 36 of summer, year 1011, after apotheosis. My spy has written to me with unsettling news. She gained access to the well-defended part of Man's City through the labyrinthian sewer system that runs beneath it. Inside, she found a massive structure of complex design and incomprehensible purpose. There are unmistakable similarities between her descriptions and the mining equipment and cannon found in Utherd. What's more, the motor carriages she was tracking were loaded into the structure. My spy's next move will be to infiltrate the structure to learn what secrets lie within. I will caution her against it, for I fear for her safety. But in truth, I too desire to learn the secrets of man. 41 of summer, year 1011, after apotheosis. This morning, man's mighty flagship, the Spirit of Eridani, was spotted steaming homeward into the ocean. With her gone, the last men have been expelled from the continent. There was celebration across the continent tonight. My clan and I were invited to the court to feast with the council. I was honored with many awards for being, as they claimed, a war hero. I appeared grateful so as not to shame my clan, but their hubris irked me. After the feast, the chair of the High Council spoke to me in private. She told me that she wanted me to hold the position of spy master permanently. Perhaps it was the wine, but I decided to try my luck, and told her I would on the condition that she allow me to attempt to uncover man's true motives. For a moment, I thought I had overstepped, but she agreed. I am now the spy master of all the realms. 44 of summer, year 1011, after apotheosis. A letter from my spy has arrived. Despite my cautions, my spy snuck into the structure under cover of night. The interior, like the exterior, was unlike anything she'd ever seen. The most peculiar aspect was that there were floors where walls should be, such that to traverse the structure, she had to walk on the walls. What's more, much of the structure was abandoned and in an advanced state of disrepair. Only one space, deep inside the structure, was occupied. There, she found men handling a strange mineral, presumably looted from Utherd, and working on a machine of sorts. Whatever technical process they were conducting was beyond her. Fearing capture, and whatever it was the men were doing, she escaped the structure and went to ground. The mystery of man thickens. Did they invade our land for whatever lay beneath Utherd? If that were true, did we stop them in time? What if man is building some sort of superweapon with what they looted? I refuse to leave the future of my people to fate. Action must be taken. 45 of summer, year 1011, after apotheosis. This morning, I requested an audience with the High Council. I was going to ask of them that we send our armies across the ocean to deliver a death blow to man before they could use whatever superweapon they were creating. That was the plan, but plans change. It was when I was walking to the palace that it happened. All around me, a seemingly random selection of elves clasped at their ears and doubled over in apparent pain. I leapt to assist the nearest, where I saw he was a forest elf. They were all forest elves. It became clear that every forest elf in sight, and as I would later learn, in the realm, were all hearing the same incapacitating noise. It lasted minutes, but listening to their screams of agony, it felt like hours. When it finally stopped, those forest's elves who could muster words reported hearing an excruciating noise, as if they were at the center of a great ocean storm. This could only be the doing of man and their sinister technologies. Once I was sure the victims were looked after, I made my way to the palace. There I found a sorry sight. The chair of the High Council, a forest elf as it happens, had died as a result of that terrible sound. At that, I forgot about my previous plan, and I proposed the unthinkable. For this, we must invoke the Godhead to put an end to man once and for all. The Godhead has been invoked thrice before, each in times of great peril. The first was a millennium ago during Apotheosis. The second was over 8 centuries ago to unify the continent in the face of Vilgava the Usurper's rebellion. The most recent was 5 centuries ago, to slay she whose name must not be spoken, who sought revenge on the mortal realm. I feared the High Council would not see how grave the threat man posed truly was. In accordance with the most ancient laws, the Godhead was only to be invoked should not doing so result in the destruction of the realm. However, with their colleague's lifeless body in hand, they understood all too well. We will invoke the Godhead. 56 of summer, year 1011, after Apotheosis. I write this from the helm of our Navy's flagship, Sholma's Wrath. Around me is the fleet. We are nearly 100 vessels strong, each crewed with sailors seeking to do to man what they did to us. Ahead of me is the land of man. Even from this distance, their polluted air makes me sick. I know they will not surrender, that they will fight to the last man. I am more than willing to let them. Behind me is the entire realm. It is filled with tens of thousands of elves who wish for us to right the greatest injustice of the century. We will not disappoint them. Above us is the Godhead. I have read historical accounts describing the Godhead, but having seen it in person, I can attest none do it justice. Be satisfied in knowing that between now and the day I die, I will never see something so awe-inspiring. We cannot lose. 58 of summer, year 1011, after Apotheosis. I should have seen it sooner, but I didn't. Yesterday the fleet, escorted by the Godhead, sailed into the lands of man. In the harbor of their great port city, a fleet of ironclads awaited us. At the head of their formation was that fearsome dreadnought, the spirit of Eridani. With the most subtle of gestures, the Godhead turned the Eridani's hull red hot. In seconds, she melted into slag. With another gesture, the Godhead consigned the rest of man's fleet to a similar grave. Man's fleet had been reduced to a molten slurry. Our sailors cheered, for the greatest symbol of man's military might had been laid to waste before their eyes. It was then that I noted something was awry. There were no screams, no sailors leaping from burning decks, no guns firing in retaliation. In fact, there were no men to be seen at all. It was then that I heard a tremendous thunderclap, then a second, then a third. There must have been at least a dozen. I thought at first that man's coastal batteries had finally fired on us, but their guns lay silent. The sound had come from above. At least a dozen spindly tubes adorned with superstructures and protrusions, each the size of a dreadnought, had descended from the clouds. Almost silently, they streaked towards us from across the horizon, leaving smog roiling in their wake. I noted they looked remarkably like the structure my spy had found at the heart of man's city. It was in that moment that I understood what man had done. I thought back to my time fighting man in the glades of the arbor. I remembered how when under attack, men would use a gadget to call for help. The gadget projected the user's voice in such a way that forest elves, with their sensitive hearing, could hear the messages. I now understood that the terrible noise heard across the realm was not an attack, but a call for help. Man did not come from the sea. They came from the stars. We were toying with powers far greater than we understood. Before I could make this clear to the Grand Admiral, the Godhead rose to face the vessels from the stars. With a flick of its wrists, the Godhead made the vessels glow red hot. The vessels stayed true, continuing to bear down on us at impossible speeds. At this, the Godhead raised all its arms, invoking some ancient spell from prehistory, and compelled the vessels to burn white hot. Still, they did not falter. Then, the unthinkable happened. I became temporarily blinded by a sudden explosion. Seconds later, a shockwave swept over us and violently rocked the fleet. With it came the thunderous retort of whatever weapon had been fired. When I regained my vision, I searched the skies for the Godhead, but found nothing. It had been slain, and nothing remained of it. The vessels from the stars soared over us and began to gain altitude until they disappeared above the smog layer. The fleet was left unharmed, but we have been sent an unmistakable message. Do not enter the land of man. 59 of summer, year 1011, after apotheosis. It rained today. The fleet has withdrawn so that the lands of man are only barely visible on the horizon. Every so often I spot a vessel descend from the heavens to land there, then hours later return to the stars. What awe-inspiring and magnificent sights are there to behold among the stars? Perhaps one day, my children will see such great things, but for now, we must continue to toil in the dirt. I began to wonder if man understood what they had done here. Did they see us as equals, but enemies of circumstance, or just insects to be brushed away? I will never know such things, but perhaps man can know what we thought of them. After I complete this last entry, I will cast my journal into the sea and let the tides carry it to the land of man. Man, rulers of the stars, this is what you did to us. Nairobi Museum of Space Exploration, the Lost Expedition Exhibit. This document was translated using an 8th-generation machine intelligence seeded with colloquialisms used by the descendants of the Lost Expedition. It was recovered by Astronaut Class 2 Mitchell Larson of the United Nations, Spinward Battle Group 3, while conducting search and rescue operations on Kepler 1319AB. This exhibit is dedicated to the men, women, and intelligent extraterrestrial life forms that were killed in the War of the Lost Expedition.